For years, the royal family believed the late monarch's final wishes had already been sealed, documented, and archived beyond dispute. But one quiet afternoon, in a private archive room deep within palace walls, Prince Edward reportedly discovered a document that no one had publicly acknowledged before a final codicil signed just one day before the Queen's death. What that document contained would ignite confusion, suspicion, and a wave of whispered questions across the entire royal household. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The moment itself seemed almost ordinary at first. Prince Edward had not entered the archive chambers expecting to uncover anything dramatic. His task was practical, almost routine. A careful review of certain private legal papers belonging to the late Queen. Documents that had already been cataloged, secured, and preserved after her passing. These archives were not public records, but personal papers, carefully stored fragments of a lifetime that had shaped an entire monarchy. Edward had been entrusted with helping oversee their organization, a responsibility rooted in trust and discretion. After all, among the Queen's children, he had long been known as the one who handled delicate matters quietly, methodically, without spectacle. For months, the archive review had moved slowly and uneventfully. Boxes were opened, files examined, seals verified. Most documents confirmed what the royal household already believed to be settled history, estate matters addressed years earlier, handwritten notes tied to charities, letters reflecting personal relationships built across decades of service. Nothing seemed capable of altering the established narrative of the Queen's final wishes. And yet, buried among these orderly stacks of papers, there was one thin file that did not quite fit the pattern. It was subtle at first, just a document sleeve placed slightly apart from the others. Its label was simple but strangely precise: Final Codicil. The phrase alone carried legal weight. Edward understood instantly what it meant. A codicil was not merely a note or an afterthought. It was a formal amendment to a will, a legally binding adjustment capable of reshaping an entire inheritance structure. Such documents were rare in royal estates because every detail was usually planned years in advance, examined by lawyers, and locked into carefully controlled frameworks. Yet this one carried something else that made Edward pause the date. It had been signed just one day before the Queen's death. For a moment, Edward reportedly stared at the document in silence, the significance settling slowly in his mind. This was not an old amendment forgotten in paperwork. It was the final legal decision of a monarch whose life had been defined by precision and duty. The Queen had altered her personal estate at the very edge of her life, and when Edward finally began to read the contents, the impact became impossible to ignore. The codicil did more than adjust minor details. It shifted the balance of inheritance itself. Assets that had previously been expected to follow a familiar distribution were suddenly redirected. The language was careful but unmistakable. The majority share of certain private holdings items tied not to the crown but to the Queen's personal estate had been reassigned. And at the center of that reassignment stood one name: Sophie. For years, Sophie had been respected within the family, admired for her loyalty and steady commitment to royal duty. But this codicil elevated her position in a way no one had predicted. The Queen had increased Sophie's share to a majority portion, effectively granting her the most significant claim among the named beneficiaries of that part of the estate. It was a decision that carried both emotional and political implications. Edward understood immediately that this was no small administrative change. This was a deliberate one that had the potential to reshape the private dynamics of the royal family. What unsettled him most was not simply the scale of the change, but the silence surrounding it. No one had mentioned this codicil publicly. No announcement had ever hinted that the Queen had amended her will so late in her life. The legal structure appeared legitimate, the signature unmistakably hers, the witnesses properly recorded. Yet the document had existed quietly within the archives, unseen by most of the household. As Edward continued reading, the reality began to settle over him with an almost surreal weight. The Queen had made a final decision in the final hours of her life, a decision that singled out Sophie in a way that suggested deep personal trust. And for Edward, the discovery was not merely administrative. It was deeply emotional. The Queen had been his mother, a figure of unwavering authority throughout his life, and now he was holding the last legal message she had chosen to leave behind. The more he studied the wording, the clearer it became that the codicil was intentional, precise, and impossible to dismiss. Every clause had been crafted with care. Every sentence carried legal clarity. This was not the hurried scribble of someone uncertain about the future. It was the deliberate voice of a monarch who understood exactly what she was doing. And yet, that realization only deepened the mystery. Because if the Queen had truly intended to alter the balance of her personal estate so dramatically, why had she waited until the final day of her life to do it? Why had this decision emerged so late after decades of carefully planned arrangements? Edward could not escape the feeling that the codicil was more than a legal amendment. It was a message, a final act of judgment about loyalty, trust, and the people who had stood closest to her in the quiet years near the end. The archive room that had once seemed calm and orderly now felt heavy with unanswered questions. Edward knew the discovery could not remain hidden forever. Eventually, the implications would ripple outward through family discussions, legal reviews, and perhaps even public curiosity. But in that first moment, as he held the document that altered everything, the question echoing in his mind was far more personal than political. But as the reality of what he was holding began to sink in, Edward couldn't ignore the deeper question forming in his mind: why had the Queen waited until the final day of her life to sign such a powerful change? In the final days of the Queen's life, the palace was cloaked in an atmosphere of quiet urgency. Family members moved in and out of private rooms, aides whispered in corridors, and the nation watched with growing concern. Yet behind closed doors, something far more consequential may have been unfolding. Because according to the codicil Edward discovered, the Queen made a last-minute legal decision that would dramatically reshape her personal legacy. Those final days were unlike anything the royal household had experienced in years. The palace had always been a place of discipline and quiet routine, but during that delicate period, the air itself seemed heavier, almost suspended in anticipation. Messages were delivered softly. Doors closed more carefully. Conversations took place in hushed tones that rarely carried beyond private rooms. Everyone understood that the Queen's health was failing, yet no one could fully prepare for the emotional gravity of the moment. For a monarch who had ruled with unwavering steadiness for decades, the thought of her final hours felt almost unimaginable. Within that atmosphere of quiet tension, trusted figures moved with careful precision around her. Senior aides remained nearby, ensuring every detail of her care and comfort was handled with dignity. Legal advisors were also present, not as intruders into a personal moment, but as guardians of the monarch's final instructions. For a queen whose life had been governed by duty and meticulous planning, even the closing chapter of her life would not be left to uncertainty. Decisions still mattered. Words still carried weight. And if the codicil Edward discovered is to be believed, One of those decisions was about to reshape the story of her legacy. The timing itself is what makes the revelation so startling. Less than 24 hours before the end of her life, the Queen reportedly approved a formal legal amendment to her will. This was not a casual gesture or a symbolic note scribbled in passing. The codicil carried all the markers of a deliberate act, proper legal phrasing, carefully structured clauses, and verified witnesses who confirmed its authenticity. Every detail suggested that the Queen understood exactly what she was doing. She was not acting impulsively. She was making a conscious and final adjustment to the way her personal estate would be remembered. That realization is what unsettled Prince Edward when he first read the document. Because the Queen had spent decades arranging the distribution of her personal assets with extraordinary care. Her estate planning had long been considered settled, refined over years with the help of legal experts who ensured every piece aligned with royal tradition and family expectations. To revise such arrangements at the very end of her life suggested something profound had shifted in her thinking. What had prompted that change remains the most haunting question surrounding the codicil. Had the Queen been reflecting on loyalty during her final days, measuring the quiet devotion of those who stood beside her when public attention had faded? Had she reconsidered the roles different family members had played in the later chapters of her reign? Or had the decision been quietly forming in her mind long before those final hours arrived, waiting for the moment when she felt certain enough to act? Because what makes the codicil so extraordinary is not merely its timing, it is the name at the center of it. Sophie. The document did more than acknowledge her. It elevated her. By increasing her share to a majority portion of the Queen's personal holdings referenced in the amendment, the codicil effectively placed Sophie in a position of remarkable trust. It was a gesture that seemed to speak volumes without offering any explanation. Inside palace circles, speculation would inevitably follow. Some wondered whether the Queen had discussed the decision privately with advisors who understood the personal meaning behind it. Others believed the choice may have been kept deliberately quiet, perhaps to avoid unnecessary family tension during an already emotional period. But what no one could deny was the symbolism behind it. A monarch known for careful judgment had made one final declaration about loyalty, devotion, and trust. For Prince Edward, the discovery created a strange blend of pride, confusion, and deep curiosity. On one hand, the document honored Sophie in a way that reflected the years of quiet dedication she had given to royal life. On the other hand, it raised questions about why the Queen had chosen that specific moment to make her final adjustment. The more Edward examined the wording of the codicil, the more he felt that the decision had not been spontaneous. There was an intention hidden within its careful language, something thoughtful, measured, perhaps even planned long before anyone realized. And as Edward studied the language of the document more carefully, a deeper pattern began to emerge, one that hinted the Queen's decision might not have been sudden at all. For years, Sophie had remained one of the monarchy's most understated figures, rarely dominating headlines, but consistently earning quiet respect within palace walls. Yet behind that calm presence was a story of loyalty, resilience, and an evolving relationship with the Queen that many insiders believed had grown unusually close in the monarch's later years. When Sophie first entered royal life after marrying Prince Edward, few could have predicted how deeply she would eventually be woven into the Queen's private world. At the time, the monarchy was already navigating a complicated era filled with public scrutiny and internal pressures. New members of the royal family were often expected to adapt instantly to centuries-old traditions, a task that demanded patience, discipline, and emotional endurance. For Sophie, those early years were not always easy. She stepped into a structure where expectations were rigid, roles were carefully defined, and every action could be interpreted through the unforgiving lens of public attention. Adjusting to that environment required more than grace, it required quiet determination. In those early days, Sophie did not try to dominate the royal stage or compete for attention. Instead, she approached her role with something far subtler. She listened, she learned, and slowly, she built trust in ways that were not always visible to the outside world. While others navigated the spotlight with varying degrees of success, Sophie developed a reputation inside palace circles as someone dependable, measured, and deeply respectful of the institution she had joined. That reputation did not emerge overnight. It grew through years of steady effort, careful judgment, and an understanding that loyalty within the royal family often reveals itself in the quietest moments. Over time, that consistency began to draw the attention of the Queen herself. The monarch had spent decades surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and family members, and she possessed an extraordinary ability to recognize sincerity. Insiders would later suggest that Sophie's approach resonated with her in a way that felt refreshingly genuine. Sophie was not trying to reshape the monarchy or redefine its traditions. Instead, she appeared committed to strengthening it from within, performing her duties with diligence while maintaining a deeply respectful relationship with the Queen. Their connection reportedly deepened during the later years of the Queen's reign. As age and responsibility gradually reshaped the monarch's daily life, Sophie was often present in ways that felt both supportive and personal. There were quiet visits, conversations that extended beyond official matters, and moments where the Queen could speak openly with someone who understood both the weight of royal duty and the human emotions behind it. These interactions were rarely publicized. They were not part of grand ceremonies or televised events. Yet those who worked closely within palace walls began to notice a pattern forming. Sophie was becoming one of the Queen's most trusted confidants. That trust revealed itself through small but meaningful gestures. Sophie increasingly took on responsibilities connected to causes the Queen deeply cared about. She represented the monarchy at engagements that required empathy and patience, particularly in areas involving vulnerable communities. And each time she stepped into those roles, she did so with a quiet dedication that mirrored the Queen's own lifelong commitment to service. It was not flashy, but it was profoundly consistent. Over time, that consistency created something stronger than public admiration. It created personal faith. For the Queen, loyalty had always been one of the most sacred qualities within the royal household. She had witnessed decades of triumphs and controversies, moments where devotion to the crown was tested in ways few outsiders could fully understand. Through those experiences, she learned to recognize the individuals who remained steady regardless of circumstance. Sophie's loyalty appeared to stand out in that regard. She did not seek recognition. She did not maneuver for influence. She simply remained present, reliable, and supportive. As the years passed, their relationship seemed to evolve into something resembling quiet companionship. They shared conversations that extended beyond formal obligations, reflecting on duty, family, and the future of the monarchy. For Sophie, these moments were not about proximity to power, they were about understanding the responsibilities carried by a woman who had dedicated her entire life to the crown. And for the Queen, Sophie's presence may have offered something increasingly rare, genuine comfort. Looking back through the lens of the Codicil Edward discovered, that relationship begins to take on an entirely new significance. What once appeared to be ordinary family closeness now feels layered with deeper meaning. The Queen's decision to elevate Sophie's share of her personal estate suddenly seems less like an unexpected change and more like the final acknowledgement of a bond that had quietly strengthened over decades. And once Edward realized how deep that bond may have run, the codicil began to look less like a surprise and more like the culmination of years of quiet trust. The document Prince Edward held was not long, but its wording carried enormous weight. In just a few carefully structured paragraphs, the Queen had altered the balance of her personal estate in a way no one had anticipated. What stood out immediately was a single clause 1 that transferred the majority share of certain private holdings to Sophie. At first glance, the document seemed almost understated. It was not filled with dramatic declarations or emotional language. Instead, it carried the calm precision typical of royal legal papers, measured sentences, deliberate phrasing, and carefully arranged clauses designed to leave no room for confusion. Yet the very restraint of its language made the impact even more striking. Because within those few paragraphs was the power to reshape the Queen's personal legacy in a way no one had expected. Prince Edward understood immediately what he was looking at. A codicil is not merely an addition to a will, it is a formal amendment with full legal authority. In the world of estate law, a codicil carries the same weight as the original document itself. Once signed and properly witnessed, it becomes inseparable from the will it modifies. That meant the Queen's final codicil was not a suggestion, nor a note waiting for approval. It was binding. It was definitive. It was the last legal instruction she chose to leave behind. And this one had been executed with unmistakable precision. The structure of the amendment was clear. It referenced the Queen's previously established estate plan, acknowledging the original provisions before introducing a modification that would alter the distribution of certain private holdings. These were not crown assets which follow strict constitutional rules, but personal possessions accumulated throughout her lifetime properties, collections, and financial interests tied directly to her private estate. Such holdings often carry deep sentimental and symbolic significance within royal families, making any adjustment to their distribution both sensitive and consequential. The clause that changed everything appeared quietly within the document's central paragraph. There was no dramatic flourish, only a carefully crafted sentence indicating that a revised share of these holdings would now pass to Sophie. But the wording left no ambiguity. The amendment granted her the majority portion of the assets covered by the codicil, shifting the balance of inheritance in a way that immediately caught Edward's attention. For a moment, he reportedly reread the line, studying its language with increasing focus. Lawyers had drafted the clause with exceptional clarity. It did not merely include Sophie among beneficiaries, it elevated her position above all others mentioned in that section of the estate. The document even included language expressing the Queen's confidence and gratitude, a phrase that stood out among the otherwise formal text. Those words hinted at something deeper than a routine financial adjustment. They suggested recognition, appreciation, perhaps even a final personal acknowledgement from the monarch to someone she trusted profoundly. The more Edward examined the codicil, the more the magnitude of the decision became impossible to ignore. This was not a minor alteration tucked into the margins of a vast estate. It was a deliberate shift in priority, executed at the very end of the Queen's life. For someone who had governed her affairs with extraordinary foresight, making such a change in her final hours spoke volumes. It meant the decision had mattered deeply enough for her to act despite the fragile circumstances surrounding her final day. And yet the legal clarity of the document raised another layer of questions. A codicil of this nature could not simply appear without witnesses. Royal legal protocol requires confirmation that the amendment was signed voluntarily and in full awareness of its implications. The document Edward held included signatures verifying that process had been followed. But the identities of those witnesses suddenly became a matter of intense curiosity. Who had been present when the Queen approved this final amendment? Had they understood the significance of the clause they were validating? And perhaps most intriguing of all, had anyone else within the royal family been aware that such a change was about to take place? Edward could feel the weight of those questions pressing against the quiet certainty of the document itself. Everything about the codicil appeared authentic. The signatures were correct. The legal language was flawless. The date was undeniable. Yet the implications of its contents stretched far beyond the technical boundaries of estate law. Because if the Queen had intentionally elevated Sophie's share in this final act, it meant she had also altered expectations that others within the family may have long believed were settled. And that realization carried a gravity that extended well beyond legal paperwork. But if the codicil was genuine, and every detail suggested it was, then its existence raised an even more delicate issue within the royal family. News of the codicil did not explode publicly overnight, but inside the royal household, it reportedly sent quiet shockwaves through private conversations and closed-door meetings. Because if Sophie's share had indeed been increased to a majority, it meant the Queen had altered a balance that many assumed had already been carefully settled. The discovery itself did not travel through the palace like gossip or scandal. Instead, it moved slowly, deliberately, carried from one trusted voice to another, with the caution that surrounds any matter tied to the Queen's final wishes. Within royal circles, discretion is not merely tradition, it is survival. Yet even the most carefully guarded information can create ripples when its implications are too significant to ignore. And this codicil, with its quiet but unmistakable language, was impossible to dismiss as routine. Behind closed doors, conversations reportedly began to unfold with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Senior members of the household were not immediately questioning the document's legality. Its structure and signatures already appeared flawless. What unsettled them was something far more delicate, the meaning behind it. For decades, the Queen had built a reputation for steady, predictable decision-making when it came to matters of family and legacy. Every element of her estate planning had been carefully arranged to preserve balance, dignity, and continuity within the royal household. Yet this final codicil seemed to tilt that balance in a new direction. The shift towards Sophie was not merely symbolic. A majority share carries weight, both financially and emotionally. It signals priority. It suggests trust placed above others. And within a family as historically scrutinized as the royal family, such a change inevitably invites questions about why it was made and what it reveals about relationships behind palace walls. Some family members reportedly reacted with genuine surprise. After all, most had believed the Queen's personal estate had been finalized years earlier, quietly structured to reflect both tradition and fairness. To learn that a final amendment had been signed just hours before her passing felt almost surreal. Others, however, responded with a quieter understanding. They had witnessed the closeness between the Queen and Sophie during the later years of her reign. To them, the codicil did not necessarily contradict the Queen's character, it revealed it. Still, uncertainty lingered in every conversation. Had anyone known this amendment was coming? That question hovered quietly in the background of every private discussion. Royal legal processes require witnesses, and the codicile's signatures confirmed that those formalities had been observed. But awareness of a legal procedure does not necessarily mean understanding its significance. Were those present simply ensuring that the Queen's instructions were documented? Or had they realized that this amendment would reshape the balance of her estate? Speculation grew carefully. Never openly confrontational, but impossible to silence entirely. Some wondered whether the Queen had confided her reasoning to someone she trusted deeply. Others believed the decision might have been kept deliberately private, perhaps to prevent unnecessary tension during her final days. And there were those who quietly admired the gesture itself, interpreting it as a final acknowledgement of loyalty that had been proven over years of service. For Prince Edward, however, the situation was more personal than political. He had been the one to discover the codicil. He had read the words that carried his mother's final legal authority, and that responsibility weighed heavily on him. Pride and confusion existed side by side in his thoughts. On one hand, the document honored Sophie in a way that felt deeply meaningful. On the other, Edward could not ignore the questions swirling quietly through the palace corridors. He found himself revisiting memories, conversations, and subtle moments from the Queen's final months, searching for clues that might explain her decision. Had there been a remark he overlooked? A hint buried in a private conversation? The Queen had always been thoughtful, deliberate, and measured in her actions. The idea that she would suddenly alter her estate without deeper reasoning seemed almost impossible. At the same time, the palace itself moved cautiously to contain the situation. The instinct of the royal household has always been to handle sensitive matters quietly, shielding family discussions from unnecessary public attention. No statements were rushed. No dramatic announcements were made. Instead, the codicil remained within a circle of trusted advisors and family members who understood the gravity of the Queen's final instructions. Yet silence did not eliminate curiosity. If anything, it intensified it. Because the more Edward reflected on the document and the timing of its creation, the more he began to sense that the codicil was not an isolated decision. It felt connected to something larger, a pattern that stretched back through the Queen's final year, perhaps even longer. Yet the deeper Edward looked into the Queen's final months, the more signs he found suggesting the codicil had been part of a larger intention. Looking back, certain moments from the Queen's final year suddenly appeared different. Conversations once dismissed as routine now seemed layered with meaning. Quiet gestures toward Sophie, small acknowledgments of loyalty, and subtle remarks about the future began to form a pattern that Edward could no longer ignore. At first, those memories surfaced only as fragments, brief recollections that drifted through Edward's mind as he continued studying the codicil. But the more he thought about them, the more they began to connect. During the Queen's later years, Sophie had increasingly become a steady presence in her life. Not in a dramatic or ceremonial way, but in the quiet rhythm of everyday royal duty. When public engagements became more demanding and the weight of age began to reshape the Queen's schedule, Sophie was often there, sometimes representing the monarch at events that required patience and compassion, sometimes simply visiting, offering conversation that was not filtered through the formal structures of palace protocol. At the time, those moments had seemed natural. Sophie was a devoted member of the royal family, and her growing involvement in royal responsibilities had been welcomed by many. But now, viewed through the lens of the codicil, Edward began to sense something deeper beneath those interactions. The Queen had not merely been assigning duties. She had been building trust. There were private meetings that few outsiders ever knew about, conversations held away from official schedules, where the Queen could speak openly without the pressure of public expectation. Sophie had been invited into those spaces more frequently as the years passed. Palace aides had occasionally noticed it, though they rarely commented on it openly. Within royal households, patterns are observed quietly, and loyalty is often measured not through grand gestures but through consistent presence. Sophie had that presence, calm, attentive, and deeply respectful of the Queen's role. Some aides later recalled small moments that now felt strangely significant. The Queen, known for her careful choice of words, had occasionally spoken about Sophie with a warmth that stood out even within a family built on affection and duty. She praised Sophie's dedication, noting how reliably she carried out responsibilities that others might have overlooked. These were not public speeches or official statements. They were quiet acknowledgments shared in private conversations, the kind that rarely find their way into historical records but linger in memory. Edward himself remembered moments that he had once considered ordinary. A brief remark from the Queen about the importance of loyalty. A thoughtful observation about how certain people prove their character over time rather than in moments of celebration. At the time, those reflections had felt philosophical, almost abstract. But now they seemed connected to something far more deliberate. Because the Queen had always been thinking about legacy. That realization became impossible for Edward to ignore as he revisited the final year of her life. Monarchs rarely wait until their final days to consider how they wish to be remembered. Such decisions unfold gradually, shaped by decades of experience and reflection. The Queen had witnessed triumph and crisis, devotion and disappointment. She had watched family members navigate the pressures of public life, each revealing their character in different ways. Through it all, she had remained observant, quietly assessing who carried the spirit of duty she valued so deeply. Sophie, it seemed, had steadily earned that trust. Palace observers had noticed how comfortable the Queen appeared during their interactions. Conversations between them often extended longer than expected, filled with thoughtful exchanges rather than formal pleasantries. Sophie was not just fulfilling royal duties, she was offering companionship during a chapter of the Queen's life when genuine connection mattered more than ceremony. That closeness, once viewed simply as familial warmth, now seemed to hint at something more profound. For Edward, the pieces were beginning to align. The codicil no longer looked like a sudden impulse created in the Queen's final hours. Instead, it appeared to be the last step in a process that had been unfolding quietly for years. Each conversation, each private meeting, each word of praise had been part of a larger narrative that few had recognized while it was happening. The Queen had been observing, reflecting, deciding. And when the moment came to finalize her personal legacy, she had acted with the same clarity that had defined her reign. The codicil was not merely a legal amendment, it was the culmination of years of trust carefully built between two women who understood the burdens of royal duty. And as these pieces came together, Edward began to realize that the Queen's final message might have been far more personal than anyone initially understood. For Prince Edward, the discovery wasn't just about inheritance or legal documents, it was about understanding the Queen's final expression of trust. Holding the codicil in his hands, he reportedly felt the weight of something deeply personal. A message from his mother that seemed to acknowledge both Sophie's devotion and the quiet strength she had brought to the family. In that moment, the legal language on the page stopped feeling like ordinary paperwork. The codicil was no longer simply a formal amendment tucked into an estate file. To Edward, It carried the unmistakable presence of the woman who had guided his entire life, not only as a monarch, but as a mother whose decisions were rarely impulsive and never meaningless. Every word she had chosen, every clause she had approved, seemed to echo with intention. And as he continued reading, Edward began to feel the emotional gravity behind those carefully constructed sentences. The Queen had always been a figure of remarkable discipline. Throughout her reign, she balanced personal affection with an unwavering commitment to duty. That balance defined how she raised her children, how she navigated the complexities of royal life, and how she preserved the institution she had inherited. Edward had spent his life watching her carry that responsibility with quiet resilience. He understood how rarely she allowed personal feelings to influence official matters. Yet the Codicil suggested something different, something more intimate than protocol. Because within that final amendment was a clear acknowledgement of Sophie. Edward knew better than most how much Sophie had invested in the royal family over the years. He had watched her navigate the pressures of royal life with patience and dignity. From the earliest days of their marriage, she had embraced responsibilities that demanded both emotional strength and public composure. There were moments of scrutiny, times when the expectations of the monarchy tested her resolve. Yet through every challenge, Sophie had remained steady. She had supported Edward's role within the institution while quietly building her own reputation for reliability and compassion. Seeing the Queen recognize that dedication carried a deep emotional resonance. It was not simply about inheritance or financial value. The codicil represented something symbolic, a final acknowledgement from the monarch that Sophie's presence within the family had mattered, that her loyalty had been seen, that her quiet strength had not gone unnoticed. For Edward, the realization created a complicated mixture of emotions. There was pride, of course, pride in the woman he had shared his life with, and pride in knowing that his mother had recognized Sophie's contribution in such a meaningful way. But alongside that pride was genuine surprise. The Queen had never hinted openly that she planned to adjust her estate in this way. Her affection for Sophie had always been visible, yet the scale of the codicil's gesture suggested something deeper than anyone had anticipated. As Edward reflected on it, memories began surfacing from across the year's family gatherings, quiet conversations, small moments where the Queen had shown subtle appreciation for Sophie's efforts. At the time, those gestures had felt natural, even routine. But now they seemed like fragments of a larger story, one that had been unfolding slowly beneath the surface of royal life. He also found himself thinking about the journey the family had taken together. The monarchy had faced decades of transformation, public scrutiny, and internal challenges that tested the bonds between its members. Through those shifting tides, certain individuals had remained constant. Sophie had been one of them. She had chosen loyalty over visibility, service over spectacle. And perhaps that was exactly what the Queen had valued most. The codicil, in that sense, felt like more than a legal decision. It felt like a quiet declaration about character. A way for the Queen to ensure that the qualities she admired, dedication, patience, unwavering support, were acknowledged in the most personal way possible. For Edward, discovering the document himself only deepened its emotional significance. It was as if the responsibility of understanding that message had been placed directly in his hands. Yet, as the emotional meaning of the codicil settled in his mind, another realization slowly began to emerge. The Queen's final decision was not only about family affection or personal recognition. It was also about legacy, about how she wished her values to be remembered long after her voice had fallen silent. But beyond Edward's personal understanding, The codicil's existence raised a much larger question about how the queen wished her legacy to be remembered. Royal legacies are rarely defined by crowns or ceremonies alone. Often, the most revealing decisions are written quietly in documents meant for the future to interpret. If the codicil Edward discovered truly represents the Queen's final instruction, then it may reveal something profound about what she valued most in her final hours. For a monarch who devoted an entire lifetime to duty, the meaning behind that final decision cannot be measured only in legal language or financial figures. The Queen's reign had always been built upon a set of unwavering principles: service above comfort, loyalty above recognition, and commitment to the crown above personal ambition. Those values shaped every stage of her life, from the moment she accepted the throne to the quiet days that marked the closing chapter of her journey. They were not merely words spoken in speeches, they were the quiet code by which she judged character. And if the codicil Edward discovered truly reflects her final will, then it may represent the ultimate expression of those values. Because in Sophie, the Queen may have seen the embodiment of everything she believed the monarchy required to endure. Sophie's story within the royal family had never been defined by dramatic headlines or commanding authority. Instead, it unfolded through patience, reliability, and a willingness to shoulder responsibility without demanding attention. Over the years, she quietly represented the crown in places where compassion mattered more than spectacle. She stood beside Edward during periods when the monarchy faced scrutiny and uncertainty. She demonstrated loyalty not through bold declarations, but through consistency, showing up, carrying out duties, and protecting the dignity of the institution she had married into. For the Queen, those qualities were never insignificant. She had spent decades observing how people responded to pressure, how they carried themselves when public approval shifted, and how deeply they understood the weight of royal responsibility. Loyalty, in her view, was not a fleeting emotion. It was something proven through time. If the codicil truly elevated Sophie's share to a majority portion of the Queen's private estate, then the gesture may have been less about inheritance and more about recognition. A final acknowledgement that Sophie had become one of the monarchy's most dependable pillars. Symbolically, the decision carries a powerful message. Royal estates often represent more than wealth; they represent memory, continuity, and the quiet story of a family's values passed from one generation to the next. By assigning Sophie a majority share of certain personal holdings, the Queen may have been doing something far more profound than adjusting financial arrangements. She may have been ensuring that someone she deeply trusted would safeguard pieces of her private legacy. And that responsibility now rests heavily with Prince Edward. Because Edward was not only the one who discovered the codicil, he became the person entrusted with understanding its meaning. As the Queen's son, he carries the emotional connection to her final decision. As Sophie's husband, he also stands at the center of its implications. The document links those roles together in a way that feels almost poetic. It is as though the Queen placed the responsibility for protecting her last message directly into Edward's hands, trusting him to ensure it would be honored with dignity and care. At the same time, the codicil quietly reshapes Sophie's place in the long narrative of the monarchy. History often remembers grand figures, kings, queens, heirs whose names dominate official records. Yet sometimes the most meaningful influence comes from those who work steadily in the background, strengthening the institution through loyalty rather than power. If the Queen's final decision elevated Sophie in this way, it may ensure that her role within the royal family will be remembered with greater significance than many ever expected. Still, one element of the story remains wrapped in mystery. Why did the Queen wait until the final day of her life to sign the codicil? That question lingers like a shadow across the entire narrative. Perhaps the decision had been forming quietly in her thoughts for years, waiting until she felt certain enough to commit it to paper. Perhaps the moment simply arrived when reflection and urgency intersected, prompting her to act before it was too late. Or perhaps the Queen understood that some decisions carry more meaning when they arrive at the very end, when they stand as the final word in a life defined by duty. Whatever the reason, the codicil discovered by Prince Edward has already become something more than a legal amendment. It has become a symbol, a final chapter in the story of a monarch who understood loyalty and who chose to honor it in a way that will be debated and remembered for years to come. And as historians, royal watchers, and insiders continue to debate the meaning of that final codicil, one question lingers in the shadows of the palace archives: what else might still be waiting to be discovered among the Queen's last private papers? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.